Welcome to our guests to the Advisory Board Centre's Roles and Responsibilities public webinar today. I'll just leave a moment for our participants to join us. It's good to have you here. So while we're having people joining us, I hope you are comfortable. Hope you have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea with you. And you've got some questions too to ask, or some commentary to share as we have these learning experiences and we learn from each other. In the control panel, you have a Q&A section there. Please type in any questions that you have. I'll be going through the information up front as information sharing, and then the lovely Bronte will be joining me and asking questions on your behalf and sharing this conversation. So welcome to the Roles and Responsibilities webinar and as part of our Executive Insight series. My name is Louise Broekman. I'm the founder and CEO of the Advisory Board Centre, and I lead the Global Research Council and the research into best practice for advisory boards globally. I'm very pleased to be able to share with you some key information that we actually provide during the Certified Chair Executive Program and for our members. I'll be sharing some of that key information with you today in considerations of roles and responsibilities. We'll be covering off on the background to roles and responsibilities and some of the research that sits behind it. Following that, we'll be looking at the evolution of roles and how they're actually varying in the market today. Then we're going to be doing some road testing and evaluating some of the best practice frameworks into different types of scenarios that are faced by advisory boards. So there's a lot of situational ethics in advisory boards. You don't necessarily know what the situation is until you're actually sitting right on top of it. So we're going to be road testing some of those ethical challenges that you have in roles and responsibilities specifically today. So we have an hour in total. I'll be providing some information probably for the first 20-25 minutes. And then we'll move into questions, so that way we keep it as topical and as relevant for you as we possibly can. So I hope we all enjoy this time together today. So the Advisory Board Centre, collectively, we are here to raise the standard of the global advisory sector so that we are driving value for professionals who are advisory board professionals and then the organisations that they serve. We operate in over 20 countries. We have about 500 members in our advisory board community in those 20 countries. And we support over 900 businesses in the last 3 years in helping them think through the different roles and responsibilities that they have for their advisory structure. Our key role is research, education, professional development, and advocacy. And I'm very pleased to have joined me today David Nash, who's going to be road testing some of these conversations with me today. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much, Louise, and it's great to be joining with you today, and I really look forward to this session and to the questions that'll come later. Thank you.
Terrific. So David is a certified chair. He's a fellow of the Advisory Board Centre, as well as a member of our global faculty. So it'll be great to have your input into this conversation today, David. Thank you. I'd also like to welcome today our members of our advisory board community who, while watching this webinar, some of them are meeting with their networks and gatherings around the world and having conversation groups either with each other or with their clients or businesses within their communities. So I welcome you all with your local gatherings and I look forward to supporting you. For other members who haven't got a local gathering, remember you can use this recording to then have conversations in your local markets with your colleagues as well as with your business networks. The foundations to our research rely on a few different things. One is the State of the Market report, which gives us a line of sight of changes in the market on an ongoing basis. That helps us to understand the growth and the impact of advisory boards. Sitting behind that is the ABF 101 Best Practice Framework, which was released originally in 2020. The Best Practice and Ethics Advisory Board oversees the ongoing development of the ABF 101. And we're going to be using this to road test some of our thinking today, specifically around roles and responsibilities. So an advisory board is really governed not by best practice standards, because there are so many different ways advisory boards can actually operate. They're actually governed by a set of principles and ethical frameworks to make sure it's fit for the environment that it's in. So the best practice starts with having purpose, then clarity and process, and then finally around people. So around purpose is ensuring what clarity of scope, and this is critically important for roles and responsibilities. I know from my experience with doing the advisor concierge process over 5 years now, that when someone's thinking about an advisory board, they'll go straight to the people, when in fact it's actually the last thing that should be looked at. If you've got clarity in the scope and the purpose of that advisory board, that will really help them to frame out what kind of backgrounds and experience is going to be relevant for what that organisation is focusing on today, but also focusing on their what's next. Following that is around the process of the structure and disciplines. What are the frameworks that are going to really drive this group to engage with each other and engage in quality conversations? And then how do organisations then measure the impact of that advisory board? Last but not least is the people component, ensuring individuals around that advisory board are independent of the organisation, but then also independent of each other, and then being fit for purpose, making sure their roles are really fit for the environment that they're in. Now, today we're going to cover off on these two particular areas in particular, of not only about roles and responsibilities, but also where these can be challenged when you've got variations to roles and responsibilities around an advisory board table, when an advisory board is being used internally inside a larger organisation, or it's project-based. So we'll be covering off on that. The best practice guidelines are resources that are provided to our advisory board professionals within our community that really help to then translate the ABF 101 best practice framework into the different aspects of managing and being part of an advisory board. What's interesting about the roles and responsibilities of best practice guideline is really focusing on the maturing of the sector, how roles are changing, the broad use of advisory boards, and what fit for purpose actually means when you have an advisory board that's a business advisory board versus an advisory board that's in a corporatized environment. And so really understanding and navigating those different environments, but still ensuring that those principles are really clear and being maintained. Let's have a look at the roles and responsibilities best practice guide. For members, that's best practice guide 205. It really clearly defines out the three different areas of roles and responsibilities. You have the role of the chair, then you have the role of advisors and or members. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then you've got the role of the organisation. It's really important in the establishment phase in an advisory board to really map out who does what you do and what you don't do. And that's really important about managing expectations across these three groups. So the role of the chair, the guidelines really focus around the independence of a chair, which is really important in being able to engage the chair with the role with the organisation as well as its role with members, so that they don't become vicariously liable for the advice across what the chair says and what individual advisors say. Having the chair also implements a best practice framework. They go through a process of establishing an advisory board. If we look at the establishment phase, a chair will generally work with the business for 3 months, a half a day a month in the business sector to establish an advisory board, taking 3 key steps in the establishment phase. In a project advisory board, that process can be truncated, or it could be extended in a corporatised environment. But establishing an advisory board and the protocols, and the chair working with the business or the organisation first before bringing on external advisors, is a really important protocol in getting the best value out of an advisory board. They then manage the advisory board protocols, so working with the organisational representative or the owner, and really being ensuring that the processes are really well road tested, and ensuring that the advisory board is really on point with the clarity of scope. The chair then manages the agenda, works with the organisation to then frame out what the agenda is going to be, sends it out to members of that advisory board, or ensures that it gets sent out with preparation for the advisor. So it's important for the chair to really ensure that the organisation is really prepared themselves for the advisory board meeting, but then ensuring that information is timely in the way it's sent out to advisors, so they in turn can also prepare. You don't want advisors as a chair to just turn up to a meeting and not having preparation or something to bring to the table. So the role of the chair is to maximise the value of those advisors and the environment that everybody is in. Then an advisory board is a moving feast. And I'll get your commentary around this soon, David, but an advisory board can change because the environment that it is in is constantly changing. So ensuring that the advisory board is reviewed on an ongoing basis. Normally, chairs review it on an annual basis, but they may be shorter than that if circumstances are changing. And part of that review is to measure the impact of the advisory board. We know that 90% of advisory boards have a positive impact around business confidence, and it's 30% impact on business confidence. So the role of the chair is critical in ensuring that those protocols in place. So you see, have we achieved what we said we were going to do? Are we on track? And has the environment changed and the advisory board needs to be refreshed, or the charter needs to change? Any which way, you can never take the advisory board for granted as a chair in the way it's being managed. Normally they meet monthly with an organisation. So advisory boards themselves will meet maybe 4 or 6 times a year, or maybe more frequently, depending on the need of the organisation. But the chair is the constant. It is the glue that keeps everything together. David, I'd love to get your feedback on what you see the role of the chair is, and from your experience as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Louise. So just really picking up on that point you just made about the role of the chair and the meetings in between the advisory board formal meetings. Very much a mentoring sort of relationship where there's dialogue going back and forth, really to ensure that the current structure, the current environment for the advisory board is still relevant and in place. So it really is a constant interaction between the chair and the business owner to make sure that the structure that's been set up to be helpful is remaining helpful. So, we can't just lock something in stone and assume it's always going to be fit for purpose. It's that really taking care to make sure that impact is flowing and that the structure that has been set up is helpful.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, David. Let's move on to advisors and members. So the role of the advisors is to make sure that they are prepared for meetings. They've got something to bring to the table, not just turn up to the table and then say, let me give you my brilliance. That's not necessarily what advisors are. The role of advisors, it's interesting when you look at it, some people think that the role of advisors is everything that they know and to share their knowledge and experience. It's actually really I think, my opinion, is that it's about the way that you listen and the way that you ask questions. So it's not what you know that's most important as an advisor, it's what the organisation knows and what they're going to do about it. So helping them to maintain their confidence in the decisions that they are making and ensuring that the really robust conversations and problem solving is happening before those decisions are made. That is truly the role of the advisor, to provide absolutely road testing thinking, to provide opinion, absolutely. You've got to be able to say what you think and provide input to it. But ultimately, it's not you to be making decisions as an advisor. It's up to the organisation. And so the way that you have conversations, not a competition, is really important. Not competing with the organisation with what they know, because that just won't work. Nor is it to compete with the other advisors. It's be able to have conversations with each other. I have an advisory board for my own business, and every time we have our own advisory board meetings, I come out of that meeting saying that's the best meeting we've ever had. And one of the key turning points for my own personal advisory board in receiving advice was seeing the advisors having conversations with each other and trying to problem solve it with me, but with each other, and thinking about how is it we're going to resolve this particular issue, or how are we going to create this, maximise the opportunity that we have. Now, the role of advisors is important around advisory board table, that not everybody is the same. They have different backgrounds. And this is where the role of the chair becomes important, to get that clarity around the scope, to identify what the priorities are for the business, to then really help scope out what kind of advisors do we need around the table and the different expertise that we have. So could you imagine how powerful it is when you've got, most businesses have an independent chair and 2 external advisors when they first start, but each of them with a different background and a different lens. So you can imagine a really good quality chair that's around, I don't know, it could be around good governance, that's scaling governance, right, for increasing the asset value of the business. You could have an advisor that's a C-suite executive who is absolutely sharp and loves spreadsheets. And then you've got an advisor that's an entrepreneur that just goes, let me just crack through that strategy and I can really help you think through something because I've just done it myself. Imagine those 3 people around a table with an organisation that they think differently, they come from different worlds. What kind of different conversation can be created when you've got that diversity of thought sitting around that table, giving their opinion, but more importantly, listening really carefully and thinking it through from a lens. Now, most advisory boards meet quarterly or 6 times a year. Now, it depends on the pace of the organisation, is if they might need to meet more frequently. Just need to be really careful not to, inadvertently become a shadow director because of the frequency and the way that advisory board meeting is managed. Again, the role of the chair is really important in this, to be able to ensure the protocols are in place so you're not creating risk around the advisory board for the chair as well as for advisors. I'll just add one more thing before I move over to you, David, for your feedback. When we're dealing with project advisory boards, they're not necessarily advisors, right? They may not be providing advice, they may be providing feedback. So it may be a customer advisory board. It could be a next generation advisory board. They're there to provide input and feedback. And so it's not necessarily the right protocol to call them advisors, but they are advisory board members. And so the roles and getting clarity around people's expectations of what is it they're contributing to it in the advisor landscape is important here. The other part of the protocol that's important in this is understanding the ethical boundaries around advisors, and we'll move on to that in a moment. So David, I'd love your feedback on what you see with regards to the role of advisors.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So I think the key there for me is that it's just really clear what role they're playing and not playing. And this is something you mentioned earlier. It's really helpful to understand what the expectations are for us to do, but also not to do. And so the role of the chair here is to really, help the business owner to prescribe what the roles are and not, so that the type of impact that they're looking for can flow and the chair can facilitate a conversation well. So, robust conversations, fantastic. Different views coming to the table, great. But really only if it's leading to the support of the business owner, the support of the decision making. So it's not designed to confuse, It's designed to bring a range of options and suggestions from advisors, from the right type of advisors, to the table to really help that business owner come to some conclusions themselves.
Yeah, thanks, David. And it's important here too that the role of the chair has to also be an advisor. The chair is not there just to facilitate other people. You need to have your own opinion and your own contribution to the conversation. You can see that with, especially in the business sector, if the chair is just facilitating everybody else, they really diminish their own value and their contribution at the advisory board table. So remember, the role of the chair is also to be an advisor. Thanks.
Can I just add one other thought there, Louise, is thinking about that role of the chair also as an advisor, choosing carefully as a chair when to speak. So definitely part of the conversation, having a view, but very much wanting to draw out the thoughts and suggestions and opinions of advisors, and choosing carefully when the chair speaks in that context as an advisor.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, David. Absolutely. Let's now have a look at the role of the organisation. The numbers up there is not a mistake. So generally you've got one chair when an advisory board starts, 2 advisors when they start, and 2 members of the organisation. So that's the normal sort of starting point. 95% of businesses, when they've have never had an advisory board before, when they come and use the free advisor concierge service. And so this is the most common sort of starting point of the makeup of an advisory board. So the organisation will generally have 2 representatives of the organisation itself. They're responsible for the agreements with members. So the agreement of an advisory board is directly between the organisation and the individual advisor. It's not through somebody else. And so the organisation is responsible for collecting those agreements. Advisory board professionals will have their own proposal format, and then they'll take that to the organisation for it to be signed from there. The organisation itself will do its own report development. It's not the role of the chair to develop the report. So in the business context, it may be a business owner, or it could be a chief operating officer that does an all business advisory board report. If you've got a governance board, that report can also be the same report, but you may point to just specific parts of it or condense it, so that way you're not creating more work when there's a lot of work that's already been put in place around the development of a report. If it's a smaller organisation, they may not have reports on everything about the business, but they may be more issues focused. So they may have a working paper or some documentation to provide the advisors. Just don't not have a report of some sort. There needs to be some way to be able to inform the advisors and the chair so they can prepare. The organisation makes decisions. The advisory board, the chair and the external advisors don't make decisions. They're there to problem solve. The organisation then makes decisions. Now, they may not make decisions, and it's best that they don't make decisions within those meetings. So in the meetings themselves, they'll say, I'm committed to making a decision, or I'm committed to follow through to investigate further to make a decision. So separating out the decision-making from the advisory board meeting is a quality process. Now, I do know an example of a governance board that have an advisory board. So they had their advisory board meeting on an afternoon, just say they have an advisory board meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. They then separate, having their governance board meeting on the Wednesday morning. Right, so it's separating it out and separating out. We had the opportunity to road test our thinking. Now, what are we committing to, and what kind of decisions are we going to make as a governance board? That's a really practical way to be able to use a governance board and advisory board together without losing momentum. I know that's a concern for some organisations about, by bringing an advisory board in and we're separating with our governance board, is that going to slow us down? It all comes back to the design and the purpose of that advisory board. The organisation themselves will generally have a coordinator who will then coordinate the meetings. You don't want your chair to be running around chasing everybody. That's not a really good use of time. So having an internal coordinator who's going to be able to bring all the free-range chickens, bringing them all in together, just really helps to keep it absolutely on point. David, what are some of the observations you've got here?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So this is where some structure and clarity on who does what, even in the small things like logistics, is just so helpful. When you were talking about reports before, yeah, definitely I've seen a really broad range of types of reports in the experiences that I've had. The ones that are helpful are the ones that help to prepare the advisors for a conversation. So if there's just not enough detail to get them some thinking time ahead of the meeting, that's where the problems start. It can turn very quickly into just a think tank, which in the right context might be right for the organisation, but not if they've sort of really gone for a best practice advisory board. So it's all about preparing for a purposeful conversation. And so just really encouraging the business to do that thinking time, to put that information out to the board ahead of a meeting, really helps the meeting to bring impact out of the conversation. Because this conversation that doesn't start with a zero starting point, there's already been some really good thinking done by the advisors ahead of the meeting. So yeah, it's just that just preparing with purpose is the way I'd put it.
Okay, thank you, David. That's great. Just quickly go through just at a high level, the difference in function. So when you look at roles and responsibilities, understanding the ethical boundaries of roles is important. And we go through this in depth at the Certified Chair Executive Program, but it's very different with the role of a director, the role of a chair, the role of an advisor, and the role of a consultant. Where it gets tricky is where a chair or an advisor is also in the role of a consultant at the same time. So David, do you want to maybe share what your thoughts are around, how do you manage those the role expectations around those three?
Yeah, thanks very much, Louise. So chair and director is a lot clearer because direction is all about making a decision. Yeah, chair, we've already discussed the role there pretty well. The one that can creep in though, and this is from personal experience, is where once trust has been built between the chair and the organisation, or the organisation and an advisor, off the back of that trust, the business owners can draw you in. They want more of you. They want your role to expand. They'd like you to go beyond presenting options and suggestions to actually doing work in the organisation. And as soon as that begins, it becomes more complex and difficult in the context of the advisory board. And that's because independence is starting to be questionable. We're actually, as a consultant, we're an outsourced worker of the organisation for a specific skill or task or project, but we're going beyond advice. We're into doing now, and that can create some real challenges as our different roles conflict. So we have to be really clear there. And that's not to say that we shouldn't potentially become a consultant, but the question becomes, should we remain an advisor in that context? What impact is the maximum impact for the business, and what role do they want us to play? That might change over time.
Yeah, and it's the change. It may not be one or the other. It could be one and the other, but at different points in time. And managing those ethical boundaries around expectations. What does get tricky around that, going to your point there, David, is that when you've got an advisor who also goes in and does consulting work, it can undermine trust in the relationship of an advisory board around the quality of your advice, about why did you provide that advice? You're trying to sell me something, and I've seen it in a few cases where it's really undermined the integrity of an advisory board when roles are getting mixed. Doesn't mean that it can't be done. It just needs to be careful and managed. I think too, David, the other interesting thing is when consulting firms are integrating advisory boards, into their service mix to their clients is it becomes a consulting piece first, rolling into an advisory board second.
Totally agree. Yeah, and the challenge there is it can be some form of A team, right? So we've got our own A team of consultants within the business, and now we'll just tag on advisory boards to it. So again, independence questionable, questionable impact from the advisory board. So these are the sorts of things that come up all the time, and we have to be, really, really clear about them. We have to think about them, and we have to talk them through with the business to make sure that we're playing an appropriate role.
Yeah, thank you. And it's the establishment phase, right? That establishment phase is key to mapping out what is the right thing to do in this situation, because what's right in one situation may not be right in another. Thank you. If we look at roles, the varying roles of advisory boards and how they impact on the roles and responsibilities. 3 different types of advisory boards. You've got an all of business advisory board, which is really used effectively in the business market, the $1.5 to $100 million turnover businesses that are looking for accountability, but they don't want to lose control of their decision-making process. And so the roles and responsibilities, like we've talked about already, is common in this part of the advisory board market, where there's an independent chair, external advisors, internal representatives. Investors get involved in this space too, but they don't take on the role of an external advisor. They take the role on the other side of the table as part of the executive team. Project-based advisory boards, the roles can be really varied in this space. And this is the exciting part of the market, which is changing rapidly. So 34% of advisory boards are project-based, and we predict that project-based advisory boards will overtake all of business advisory boards in the longer term, because it is such an effective management discipline that can be really there to really break through a strategy or get the market involved. So you look at customer advisory boards, you look at next generation advisory boards, you get advisory boards around cyber, about supply chain, about entering new markets. You get aged care around their consumer advisory boards or clinical or ethical advisory boards. The variations to this is really quite interesting. And the role of independence then shifts from the chair may not be independent, the chair may be an internal executive, but the members of the advisory board might be independent. And so that mapping of those around best practice around project advisory boards just means it just varies around who the different players are in the advisory board. What's important in project advisory boards is the charter to ensure that the members of the advisory board are not going into areas that the organisation doesn't want them to go into. So the charter becomes really important. And again, the role of the chair in establishing this well is important. Corporatised advisory boards is the larger organisations supporting the governance board by having these thinking systems around the governance board and as part of an ongoing structure of governance. So corporatised advisory boards, what's really important here in the role of a chair is to map it out very, very carefully about where the role of the advisory board is, who it reports to, and the other protocols around confidentiality, reporting lines, all of those things need to be really carefully considered. David, have you got some thoughts around these 3?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So when we start to move into project advisory boards and corporatised advisory boards, very often the number of stakeholders increase. And so it's just so important in that establishment phase that there's clarity around the roles, the responsibilities, who the advisory board will report to, what does that reporting look like, the level of confidentiality or otherwise. There's a whole range of questions that come up in project and corporatised advisory boards to a much greater degree than come up in advisory boards for the business sector. So I completely agree with you that because of the problem-solving ability of an advisory board, we'll see a lot of growth in both project and corporatised advisory boards. You know, to deal with projects that are you know, difficult and complex, definitely. To deal with situations of complex governance where the governance board just simply doesn't have the time or the skill set to focus on the issue of the day, the priority of the day. So, but we really do need to, I think, stress that the best practice principles play really well in this space to get real clarity around the roles and responsibilities as we move into the project and corporatized space.
Thank you. And the scoping out of the advisor role. So what is the advisor role in a project advisory board that's very specific? So we talk about diversity around an advisory board table. Sometimes diversity in backgrounds when you're looking for something that's really specific is going to be really different to something that's more generalized. So like a next generation advisory board, you might have, like Deloitte, have set up advisory boards in Africa with their next generation, where they get a sample of employees across their different countries coming together and having more generalist in nature. So again, it's around what's outlined in that charter. All roads lead to that charter, don't they, David? Just want to outline some new roles that we are seeing in the market today. There is the role of an advisory board manager. So there's a role that's being advertised right now today for Amazon, for an advisory board manager, for a consumer advisory board. So actually getting professional managers now whose role is to coordinate the different stakeholders, bringing in the coordination of meetings, the follow through, because in that particular advisory board is co-creating their future product and their future way that they go to market. And so it's the outcomes of those advisory boards and what they do with them and have the follow through so that they don't lose the innovation that comes out of an advisory board setting. So I think this is a really interesting development in the market, specifically around consumer advisory boards. You get the role, which is also a variation, which is a chair to the board. So some organisations may say, I've got a governance board. I don't necessarily want to create more noise by having a separate advisory board, but we want to have a good quality chair for our governance board and bring advisors to come in as we need them. So that's where you get the two roles, the chair to the board and advisor to the board. So the chair to the board needs to be very, very carefully scoped out because they're not a director on the board, but they're chairing and facilitating the board, and they may get guest advisors who are specialists who come in to meet with the governance board. So these hybrid models need to be very carefully managed, but they can be highly effective. Now, David, I'm going to road test some scenarios with you. We've got 5 minutes and then we'll move into Q&A. So we're going to use the best practice principles and I'm going to test some thinking around that. So probably leave about a minute each. You're all good with that?
Great, let's go.
Okay, all right. So we're going to use a scenario. The client has asked an advisor to complete a project internally. What are the considerations for both the client and the advisor?
Yeah, so we're going into a doing role. Yeah, along the lines that I was mentioning earlier. So we're going beyond advice, options, suggestions in the context of an advisory board. We need to be thinking about how taking on that project role, that doing role, will impact our ability to serve on the advisory board. So it's not to say that we couldn't take on that role. We just need to really chat through with the business owner how that's going to work and how that might impact our role on the advisory board. So the principles at play here, definitely clarity of scope for the advisory board, definitely independence. And, you know, we're in our principles, we're in the people space. So, you know, is it fit for purpose? Or is that changing now? So, yeah, really, really important that we have some very clear communications around what this new role might be and how it might impact the advisory board.
And it may be that you step down from the advisory board during that period of completing the project and stepping back up again.
Might be.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Thank you. Scenario number 2. In a corporate environment, the project advisory board development requires significant coordination. Whose role is it to bring it all together?
The coordination. So we mentioned a coordination role before. Now, certainly it could be a range of people. I mean, the chair definitely has a coordination role. The important point here is making sure that there's clarity around who it is. So a danger in the corporatized space is that there may be people and levels of the organisation who don't like the fact that this corporatized advisory board exists. So there could be the potential for sabotage. So we just have to be really clear with all the stakeholders as to who is going to coordinate, who's going to take that role, so that they're not undermined. So yeah, really getting into the charter and being very clear in that, the person who will take that coordination role, and making sure that they're not someone who's going to actually cause political challenge in the organisation. I would sort of, I'd sort of suggest that. So again, definitely in the principal's place, getting the structure and disciplines right to be able to coordinate well is super key there.
Thank you. So you have a sponsor or the person who's really driving, the champion of it, and then you've got the coordinator. That's the most typical structure there. Thank you. All right. I think this is the last one. You're on the informal advisory board as an advisor and you see opportunities for improvement. What would you do and should you do it?
So we're in the informal space. So we've got to acknowledge that. And I'm just going to assume that we're in that space because that's what the business preferred, an informal space. So, so roles and structure, more fluid in that sort of space. I guess what I would say is that that we just need to be really transparent as to where our contribution's coming from. Even in an informal space, as soon as we throw our independence out the window, yeah, we're really going to struggle to have impact. So we just need to be transparent, I would say, in the contribution that we have and where we're coming from and where we might be conflicted. So just being transparent about our role, the level of independence we have or not. But at the end of the day, particularly in an informal space, it's up to the business owner to determine what's fit for purpose.
I think that's really important, David, where the role of the advisory board is to not judge them for what they're trying to do. And it's what we call meeting them where they are and then bringing them on that journey. So for those of you that are business owners in this call today and you're putting together an informal advisory board, good on you for doing that. And just know that it can evolve over time. Doesn't need to be perfect just to get it started and putting in place. That's what I did with my first advisory board. I didn't know what one was, so I just threw it together and I chaired it myself, and it was a bit of chaos there for a while, but finally we worked out what it was. It's important, I think, for advisors not to judge, but understand what they're trying to do and then take them on that journey over time.
I'd probably just add to that, Louise, and say my first advisory board experience wasn't called an advisory board. It was some kind of a think tank. What was interesting, though, is that as knowledge of best practice around advisory boards has grown, there's been that desire for more structure. So, yeah, I think, every setting's different. But I do think business owners do often go on a journey here of not sure I want the structure, but then some lived experience. Okay, actually, I do want a little bit more structure, and just being able to access that through the best practice principles of the centre yeah, it can be really, really helpful.
Terrific. Thank you. Now, I've just got some questions that have come through here. I'm just going to go to the Q&A button first, where we've got Karen asking a question here. How do the expectations or requirements of an advisory board differ for a not-for-profit organisation? For example, I've been asked to be part of an advisory board for a charity to help them craft a strategy for growth. Not-for-profit's a really interesting one, Karen, from my experience, where is it a pro bono role or is it a paid role? And there are ethical challenges, I think, in where a lot of not-for-profits don't pay their board, but then they want to get specialist knowledge in around them in an advisory capacity. Does it get paid or not? I think the nature of the work itself, beyond navigating what's the right structure around that to do, the nature of the work itself is the same. Having an advisory board to help craft a strategy for growth, I think, is a terrific opportunity to really have an impact. Again, being really clear about the charter, what you're there to do, will help you really to stay focused. And I guess that's just outside of, do you get paid or not get paid? David, do you have any comments around Karen's question?
Yeah, I'd just say, build off what you just said, Louise, that just getting clarity on the expectations, and particularly in pro bono settings, is really important. And that's for both sides. So, yeah, I think to ensure that you get the right focus around a project like strategy development, the right people in the room, but real clarity on how far that role extends, particularly in a pro bono setting, really helpful.
Yeah, good, thank you. Now, moving across now to Coralie. Coralie writes here, when we say reports, do we mean reports from the advisory board to the organisation on how the advisory board is progressing? Or do we mean a report from the organisation on where the organisation is at when it's looking for from the advisory board? I'll start on this one and I'll go to you, David. Two things here. The organisation should provide a report to the advisory board, whether it's all business or project based, on what that advisory board is there to review and talk about. And so the organisation provides the report. Now, that may come from the owner, may come from the CFO, may come from whoever the manager is of that advisory board, or the owner of the specialist area that they're focusing on. But having a report going to the advisory board with questions for the advisory board members so that they can prepare for the meeting is really worthwhile. Now, the advisory board itself don't provide a report back to the organisation, but the chair ensures in the first instance, say we take an example of all of business advisory board, a chair will, in the establishment phase, do a full governance check. So there'll be a governance pack that the business puts together that will really inform the advisory board members to have an orientation before the advisory board starts. Now, the chair will also measure where the business is at to then create an impact measurement system to get that advisory board ongoing. And the chair will run that survey and that report with the businesses at least every 12 months. And that will help the chair to really work with the business owners themselves, evaluating what's been the impact of the advisory board and have our needs changed. And so that's a report that they review together. The business owners complete the survey to produce the report, and then the chair then provides feedback back to the organisation. That's called a business growth score. So our certified chairs are trained in how to use that, and that's part of their membership. But any which way, whether you're a member or not, a chair, it's really important to have a measurement system and a way to report in on what the impact is of that advisory board itself. David, you got any comments around that?
I'd just add to that, Louise, that that impact reporting really should tie all the way back to the charter and the impact and impact measurement that was identified at that stage. So it's got to be fit for purpose reporting. The other couple of things that just popped into my mind were the minutes themselves of an advisory board. you know, is one of the key outputs from the meeting. It really does help the business in the time period between meetings to think about the decisions that they might have to make off the back of that. And also the really key capturing of action items, not for the board to do, but for the business. So the business will commit to various actions. And so capturing those is a key output from an advisory board meeting. Probably if we then jump across to the corporatized sort of environment with probably a lot more stakeholders, there can be more formalized reporting that comes off the back of an advisory board meeting. But from the perspective of keeping stakeholders who should be informed as to what's been happening. So yeah, can be a little bit more reporting. Let's say the situation where there needs to be some information flow up to the governance board. In that environment.
Thank you. Got a question here from Wendy. Will you offer a certification for an advisory board manager in the future? Good question, Wendy. Professionals who are part of corporatized environments complete the Certified Chair Executive Program, and that gives them all the protocols to manage as an advisory board manager. So that would be the most relevant credential for advisory board managers. I'm going to hand this one over to you, David, from Karen. How do the expectation, that we did that one. So I'll move over to one from Annette. Do you offer bylaw or governance templates?
So within the materials available to members of the Advisory Board Centre, there are several guidelines that we do utilise in conjunction with the best practice principles. There's also a range of templates that's available to members of the Advisory Board Centre that they can utilise in business settings. The Centre's been really good and clear about its IP and the IP that it shares with its members and certified chairs. And there's a different level of IP available to certified chairs from that available to advisors. And from personal experience, those guidelines and templates have been extremely well received by business. I mean, a great example is the template for a charter. So for someone who's never seen a charter before, it's a really, really helpful starting point, covering a lot of the issues we've talked about today. And I often see just an absolute light bulb moment for a business owner as they see that template charter for the first time. They go, right, now I can sort of see how this comes together. I can see why it's important to specify roles and responsibilities. I can see why it's important to specify the structure of the meetings that we're going to go into. So there's a lot of IP within the centre, and the way it's utilised seems to have impact.
Thank you. And the Board Starter Program is a really good example of that. So it's a template, is a template, but it's ensuring that the education goes with the best way that it gets implemented internally. Coralie, thank you for your question. I'm not quite sure what the question is, so if you can just maybe reword that for me, that'd be, I'd appreciate that. So I'll just move over to Stuart. Is the emergence of technology ethics, e.g. use of data, AI, in business impacting the role of advisory boards, or perhaps the type of expertise comprising boards? Stuart, that's a really good question. When you look at ethics advisory boards being used more than ever before, you're looking at, say, the Facebook or Meta, their advisory board. You just need to Google the look of their advisory board. It's really interesting to see the way that they're structuring it. And you look at universities, you look at the biotech sector, and the use of technology just generally. I think ethics advisory boards is going to be used more and more, and used within a corporatized environment as well. So thank you for bringing that up. David, do you have any comments around ethics advisory boards?
I just add to that, Louise, that particularly in areas around technology, and the ethical considerations therein. I mean, that's one of the most complex topics that governance boards are trying to grapple with. So it's the perfect sort of topic and issue for an advisory board that's been well built with the right voices around the table. So I think very much we should expect to see a growing level of particularly corporatized advisory boards supporting governance board decision-making in these areas.
Thank you, David. And Ed and Garana, thank you so much for your kind words there as well. Just as a wrap up, there are two things that I guess we've got different people in this webinar for different reasons. For those of you that are business owners or organisations considering an advisory board and here to think through what's the best approach for us, we have a free service called the Advisor Concierge. You can scan, everything's a scannable code these days, to get more information about the Advisor Concierge, where we help you to evaluate what are your business priorities and what are your different options that you have in your advisory structure. We don't charge for that service. We also don't take percentage fees, rebates, or any kickbacks if you decide to go ahead with engaging with any of our independent members. But it really is helpful for organisations of all sizes that are connected in with the Advisor Concierge to really get clarity around their thinking from all around the world. The other component is those of you that are considering becoming an advisory board professional, and the Certified Chair Executive Program is our key resource and method to know the foundations of advisory boards. So have a look at that as well. For our members, I want to thank you for being part of this best practice community. People like you, David, who are committed to best practice and being impactful in their experience in using advisory boards as a way to be able to use your experience to make a difference to others. So thank you for doing that and for holding your localised events, and also keep an eye out for our best practice workshops, which is all going to be about providing feedback on the business growth score method. So I look forward to having that internal sessions with our community soon. Thank you everybody for being here. We're a few minutes early, as a good meeting should be. David, if you've got any last words of advice and pearls of wisdom for our participants today.
Oh, thanks, Louise, and thanks for the opportunity to join you today. I would just probably say to the business owner out there, who's thinking about this and not sure, make a start. Just make a start. Learn more about the sector. Learn more about what a best practice advisory board is and looks like. For the person contemplating undertaking the Certified Chair Program, I joined the Centre as an advisor first. And then as I got to meet and learn from more of the cohort, I was encouraged to undertake the Chair Program. And I just could not have predicted what would happen off the back of that. So I think to everyone, I'd just say, making a start, take a small step. Yeah. That'd be my last thing to say. Thanks.
Thanks, David, and thank you for taking the time to share this with me today. Please connect in with us. Please connect in with David on LinkedIn, and for our members on Advisory Board World, connect in with David as well. Thank you for being here and for being curious about best practice for advisory boards and the roles and responsibilities. We'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.